Occasionally a guy will start a YouTube channel and seemingly disappear. Promising scripts on promising games can turn out to be hugely disappointing. Addictive Korean MMOs can suck up an embarrassing amount of time. Getting back into D&D wasn't exactly great for productivity. And a few 20-page papers can ensure a level of inactivity. But I'm back, at least sort of, for now, to answer the question why courtroom games are awesome. And to do so, I'm going to have a look at two related examples, Phoenix Wright and Aviary Attorney, two games that on the surface are goofy entertainment, but that also challenge notions of law and order in their own respect. Mechanically, these games are nearly identical. The player assumes the role of a defense attorney in each, charged with defending a client, usually for murder, that the defendant claims not to have committed. The odds are stacked against you, and in the style of Japanese visual novels and adventure game item logic puzzles, the player begins to unravel the mystery, proving their client innocent while simultaneously ferreting out the guilty party. The cases these games present are broken into two distinct sequences, an investigation phase before the trial and the trial proper. The former lets the player meet characters, gather evidence, and get introduced to the general principles to be involved in the case, while the latter revolves around using evidence and logic to break down testimonies given on the stand before a judge. Within this simple system, these two games raise surprisingly nuanced critiques of their respective legal systems. In order to appreciate the value of courtroom games, it's worth exploring their lineage. There's nothing new under the sun, of course, and this genre of games is no exception. Aviary Attorney was clearly inspired by Phoenix Wright, and Phoenix Wright creator Shu Takumi has cited the old television series Columbo as a big influence for the game's inception. But the structure of how cases are presented and resolved in both of these games is structurally identical to another old television show, a show that provides greater insight into how this form of entertainment functions both as enjoyment and criticism. Perry Mason. Perry Mason was a television program that aired on CBS from 1957 to 1966. It chronicled the investigation and cases of hard-working defense attorney Perry Mason. The show would always open with a crime, usually a murder, being charged against an innocent defendant that Perry Mason would then investigate and defend. After a series of questioning and investigations, Mason and his secretary would unravel the mystery and force the guilty party to confess to the crime during the trial.
No, Mr. Nichols. You didn't kill Thompson. But you did, Mr. Wells.
Yes! Yes, I killed Ned Thompson! I killed him! I killed him! I killed him! I killed him!
Does that sound familiar? And the show was hugely popular. So let's take a look at the cultural climate of America in the 1960s. Countercultural movements were sprouting up like crazy. Dissatisfaction was being voiced in nearly every arena of American life, and law enforcement was no exception. In the mid-1960s, the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice conducted numerous surveys and studies exploring the public's perception of American law enforcement. They found that, even though most people polled never really dealt with the police for assistance, a large portion of the American public viewed the police and the legal system as ineffective. Subsequent studies have shown that the early to mid-1960s marked the beginning of public opinion falling overall with law enforcement on the whole. This shift in public opinion makes it easy to see why a show about a lawyer constantly proving cops and haughty prosecutors wrong but still serving justice would be so popular. Perry Mason regularly outsmarted inept cops and obnoxious prosecutors, saving an innocent party while finding the guilty one. The show called into question the established institutions and norms of law enforcement while still maintaining social order and due process. It challenged the methods and biases of law enforcement while still achieving justice. So do these courtroom games that follow this exact same narrative structure do something similar? Essentially, yes. But what is Phoenix Wright challenging? If you were anything like me back in 2005, you simply wrote off the first game in the series as a foray into the absurd. After all, what kind of legal system has prosecutors with perfect winning records? What kind of legal system has so many innocent defendants plead guilty before trial? Well, the answer may surprise you, because it's the Japanese legal system. Although Japan as a nation has one of the lowest crime rates in the world, Japan's legal system has a staggering conviction rate of over 99%. And while this is due in large part to the stringent selection of cases that actually go to court by prosecutors and law enforcement, there are a number of darker factors that contribute to this astronomically high number. a number so high that miscarriages of justice are pretty much guaranteed. Consider this. The Japanese legal system places a large importance on confessions. An estimated 89% of guilty verdicts come by way of direct suspect confession. And that's all well and good, but why is it so high? Well, here's a clue. After being arrested, suspects can be detained for up to 28 days without bail or access to regular legal counsel. This detention can be further extended to another 28 days by slightly changing the charges. In a sense, suspects held under suspicion can be held almost indefinitely. Allegations of abuse and coercion are common, and there's no small amount of guilty verdicts leading to incarceration that are acquitted years later. One famous example is the case of Mr. Kazuo Ishikawa, a man arrested for murder in 1968. He was held without legal counsel for days before being tricked into signing a confession, despite being illiterate at the time. Stories like this are common, so much so that human rights groups such as Amnesty International have gotten involved in trying to change the system. In Phoenix Wright, the player often has to defend clients that have pleaded guilty despite being completely innocent and knowing it. The circumstances are often obtuse and outside the purview of such abuse, but to the player savvy with this aspect of Japanese law, it recontextualizes the gallery of colorful characters asking for legal assistance. In addition to this, the Japanese legal system for the most part has lacked a jury system since 1943. Judges act as deciding voices in a case's outcome, giving attorneys much more insight into how to present their cases. Cases are often tailored specifically for certain judges in mind, making a guilty verdict that much easier to achieve for prosecutors. Compound this with the fact that Japan follows a largely inquisitorial legal system, meaning judges are active participants in working with the prosecution and questioning witnesses and suspects, and it paints a pretty frightening picture for defense attorneys and their clients. Edgeworth knows exactly how to paint his case in the eyes of the judge, and the judge is actively in cahoots with the prosecution on the case. Speaking of which, throughout the series, Phoenix Wright as a character is not shown the same level of respect and patience in the courtroom as prosecutors. Players only have a handful of slip-ups allowed before losing a case, whereas the prosecution is given a much higher degree of lenience and patience. During investigation phases, players have to be creative and diplomatic in order to get information for their case from key NPCs such as witnesses, suspects, and even the cops, whereas it's heavily implied in the dialogue. All a prosecutor has to do is show up and ask a couple questions, and every convenience will be afforded them. This is a byproduct of Japanese culture in which prosecutors are held in extremely high esteem, while defense attorneys are not so much. All things considered, it is not hard to see the criticism of such a system going on in Phoenix Wright. Sure, it's fun and wacky or whatever, but at its core, the game is about defending innocent parties in a system seemingly engineered to churn out guilty sentences. Phoenix, and thusly the player, has to grasp at any and every desperate thread to beat the odds and constantly fight uphill battles to ensure the truth comes to light. All in all, it's a pretty brilliant game when you think about it. But if the intelligence of Phoenix Wright lies in its allegorical reading of the Japanese legal system, the intelligence of Aviary Attorney lies in its applicability exploring the meaning of law as a whole. Outside of the mechanics, a casual player will notice two things about Aviary Attorney right off the bat. The first is the character presentation and general art design, which in my opinion is not simply an incidental gimmick. The developers smartly chose to have their characters come from the 19th century illustrations of J.J. Grandville. In addition to being wildly popular for just being good art from a technical perspective, the illustrations placed emphasis on satirizing the class and political systems of the day. The idea was basically to characterize the vices, biases, and weaknesses of these figures, using characteristics often attributed to animals. For example, judges and the clergy were portrayed as hungry wolves, often looking out for their best interests alone. Stuffy industry tycoons were portrayed as proud lions, unbeatable and unflappable in every circumstance. It was a creative and visual way to suggest that all walks of life had their own problems to deal with, their own ideologies and concerns. These illustrations suggest that each class, each position in life, has its own point of view. This is important to keep in mind as we move on to the second thing players will likely notice, the setting. Aviary Attorney has the unusual distinction of being placed in 19th century France, specifically the days before the French Revolution of 1848. Now, I realize I've already thrown a lot at you in this video, so I'm not going to recap the entire ordeal. Instead, all I'll say is that this revolution was similar to most successful revolutions, in a sense that the previous government was essentially dissolved and later a provisional government was set up. Periods between such institutions are often fraught with fear and uncertainty regarding very simple things like law, power, superiority, civil rights, morality, and so on. To illustrate this, let's take a look at a very famous painting. This is Lamartine in front of the Town Hall of Paris rejecting the red flag on the 25th of February, 1848 by Henri Félix Emmanuel, Philippe Pétain. The painting is a work of realism, but really all you need to do is count the flags present in the painting. Here we have 2 different tricolors. There's a third one in the back with a crest, and a 4th flag right here, the red flag of the Communist Party. Each is a symbol of their respective factions, ideals, ideologies, all of which have conflicting views on basic governance and law enforcement. The genius of placing this game in this setting is that it allows players to experience the pursuit of justice when the social fabric of France dissolves around them. The player takes the role of J.J. Falcon, a defense attorney charged with defending the innocent in a socially tumultuous environment. In doing so, the player is forced to answer questions like, what is the role of justice when the law is changing? What is the role of justice in the absence of law? What is the difference between law enforcement and revenge? What is the role of justice in society? Does it differ from law? Where does morality come into play in law enforcement? And whose morality is best? Throughout the game's 5 cases and overarching story, players are forced to come to terms with the fact that the answers to these questions are not always cut and dry. That justice is a societal construct, susceptible to the input and influence of worldviews that often oppose our own. Which brings me to the answer of why courtroom games are awesome. Games like Phoenix Wright and Aviary Attorney allow for players to explore these difficult questions. They allow for the first-hand navigation of questionable legal systems. They allow us to feel personal righteousness when discovering truth, but also the realization that justice is often muddled by the complexity of modern society. And you gotta give them a nod for that. Anyway, sorry for disappearing. I can't promise more videos more frequently or anything like that, but I can promise I'm always playing games and always thinking of the next video. I have a couple scripts on the books and a ton of footage, so until then, take care and best wishes.